All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to take a look at time period number 2 today, which spans from 1607 to 1754. The dates really correspond to some major events in colonial history. So 1607 is the foundation of the first major British settlement, which is Jamestown, which is located in the Chesapeake Bay region. And 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War. So this kind of defines time period number 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some major characteristics economically, religiously, and socially, and also politically about the British colonies that are forming and really developing in this time period. Now, the thing that we're going to have to try to do, you want to know these as major characteristics, and you want to think of what makes the British colonies unique and different as compared to the Spanish colonies and the French colonies, and then what do they actually share in common as colonial counterparts, because the Spanish are still in existence in South America and Central America with colonies. They're also in North America as well, and the French are starting to develop colonies in North America. So as we go through this, you want to take notes about the big characteristics of the British, but we're also going to try and do comparisons between the Spanish and the French. Okay, so the first big area that we're going to take a look at is going to be mercantilism. So mercantilism is the economic system that the British set up to regulate trade between the colonies and the mother country, or the metropole, which is Britain. So what exactly is mercantilism? So mercantilism is this idea that the British and also all of the other European powers subscribe to in the time period, which is that you as a power want to have a favorable balance of trade. And what that means is that you want to export more products than you import into your nation. So as a country, you're trying to export more products than you import. Why do you want that? Essentially what that does is that brings in wealth into your nation. It brings in gold and silver into your nation, and it also creates jobs in your nation. And it makes other countries dependent upon your products. So your goal here is to become an exporting nation that exports products to other countries. So that is kind of an ideology that the European countries of the time period really subscribe to. Now, how do the colonies, the British colonies of North America, fit into this mentality? Essentially, what they're going to be doing is expanding the nation of Britain. Because remember, this is a part of the British Empire at the time. So they're really expanding the resources that Britain has available to them to develop manufactured goods and produce things for the world. And the big thing that the colonies are going to add into this system is going to be providing raw materials back to the British. So they're going to be providing things like cash crops back to the British that the British are going to turn into finished products and sell to the rest of the world. So in order for this to work, the British have to pass a series of laws to regulate trade between their North American colonies and their Caribbean colonies and Britain. So they pass a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts, starting in the 1650s. And there's a series of navigation acts, and what these acts did was they enumerated certain products that the colonies could only trade with Britain. And usually they enumerated products that were going to generate considerable wealth for Britain. That's the first element of it. The second element of what they tried to regulate was try to prohibit their colonies from manufacturing products, because if the colonies can manufacture goods, really there's no need to trade these things back to Britain. So they wanted to keep the colonies dependent on them, and they also wanted to keep the rest of the world that they're trading their manufactured goods to dependent on them as well. So when you look at this idea, how does this compare to the Spanish and the French? So both the Spanish and the French also are going to implement and use the idea of mercantilism. Although they implement it a little bit differently. So the Spanish also are going to be heavily reliant on cash crops coming back into Spain, but they're also reliant on a lot of gold and silver that are mined in South America and Central America coming back into Spain to generate wealth as well. The British are a little bit more lax in how they enforce mercantilism than the Spanish are. The Spanish are a little bit more strict in the way that they enforce this trade and this mandatory trade back with Spain. Britain kind of looked the other way a little bit in a lot of time periods when their colonists would illicitly trade with other nations out there in the world. The French, on the other hand, they're really not interested in developing big plantations and cash crop economies in their North American colonies. They're much more engaged in fur and skin trade. So they get very involved in trading furs like beaver furs and skins back into Europe. And that's kind of like their element of being involved in this mercantilist system. Okay, so in the British colonies, religiously speaking, the type of Christianity you want to associate with the British colonies is going to be Protestantism. And so there's quite a few denominations of Protestants that come to the New World and set up colonies in the British colonies. And so the primary religion of England is called Anglicanism, and that's the official church of England. But you also have a lot of minority religions in England and dissenters from the Anglican Church. So the Anglicans are going to come to the New World and be a part of the British colonies, but you're also going to have some other major religious groups, specifically the Puritans, who are going to set up a lot of colonies in New England, specifically Massachusetts Bay and a number of other colonies up in New England. You also have the Quakers who come to the New World, who famously set up the colony of Pennsylvania. Those are just a couple of examples of some of these minority religious groups that come to the New World to kind of set up their kind of utopian ideas within the British colonies. And so that's the first thing to kind of note down. There's Protestantism in the British colonies, but there's a lot of diversity within religious groups within the British colonies. Part of that is due to people trying to leave, minority groups trying to leave Britain and set up their own systems within the British colonies, but also part of it is due to the fact that within the British colonies themselves, you have some colonies that have a lot of religious tolerance. So it's not widespread in the British colonies. It's kind of a situation of two different types of situations within the British colonies. So you have places like, a good example would be Rhode Island. Rhode Island, which is set up by this man right here named Roger Williams, really allows for a high degree of religious tolerance in the colony. So it kind of is the birth of this idea of freedom of religion within the British colonies. And then you also have colonies like Pennsylvania, set up by William Penn, which also have religious tolerance and are very tolerant of other religious groups. Now, on the flip side, you also have some British colonies that are very intolerant of other groups. So the most famous intolerant colony that's set up is going to be Massachusetts Bay. So Massachusetts Bay actually spawns the colony of Rhode Island, which Roger Williams sets up, and this other religious dissenter, Anne Hutchinson, ends up fleeing to because they can't fit into the intolerant society that is set up in Massachusetts by the Puritans. So you have a tale of kind of like some colonies are very tolerant, some are very intolerant. Now, how does this compare to the Spanish and the French? The Spanish and the French are both Catholic powers. So they are Christian, but they're trying to establish and spread Catholicism in the New World. The Spanish, it's very important to the Spanish to bring Catholicism to the Native American population. They want to, through the encomienda system, spread Catholicism all throughout the Native American population and in the New World. The French also try to convert the Native American population to Catholicism, although they're not as heavy-handed as the French are, and they don't bring over quite as many missionaries to try and convert the natives. They still are interested in it. The British are less interested than both the Spanish and the French in converting Native American populations to Protestantism. It's not a major concern of the British colonies. They're more concerned with setting up their own religious utopian communities within the New World. Okay, now, as far as the British are concerned, there is a unique religious movement that breaks out in the British colonies, which really there is not an equivalent in either the Spanish or the French colonies, which is an event known as the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening begins in the 1730s, and it spans all the way into the 1760s, beyond this time period, into the end of the French and Indian War. So the Great Awakening is this new religious movement that is going to stress a new type of Christianity that begins in England called evangelical Christianity or evangelicalism. And evangelicalism really kind of stresses the idea that people can commit sins, but if they genuinely seek forgiveness and reconciliation for those sins, they can be forgiven and they can be born again. So it's this whole idea that you can have a second chance in life and a second chance at achieving salvation, which is a stark difference between a lot of the Puritan ideology that's being taught, where they don't really believe in this. They believe in this kind of concept of the elect, right? So this is new. And then some other aspects that are kind of new and different is they really emphasize emotional based preaching. So if you look out here, this is an outdoor revival meeting that this painting is showing, which was common in the Great Awakening. And outdoor revival meetings really kind of emphasize emotional style preaching. Now, your most famous preacher in this era is a guy named George Whitefield, who you see a picture of right here. And he kind of goes out and he tours up and down the colonies preaching this new evangelical Christianity. And he actually comes from Britain. So it starts in Britain and spreads to the New World. And it becomes pretty popular. It causes some division within the colonies and division within religious communities, and it creates even more religious diversity and new religious denominations within the British colonies. So there's really not an equivalent here in the Spanish or the French. The Spanish and the French have missionaries that come, the Franciscans and the Jesuits, but it's not really the same kind of vein as the Great Awakening. Okay, the next big thing that is kind of a characteristic here of the British colonies, we have to talk about the transition that takes place in their labor systems. So when you think of the British colonies, the original labor system in a lot of these British colonies, specifically in the Chesapeake Bay and the Lower South, or not really the Lower South, more the Chesapeake Bay, is going to be a system known as indentured servitude. So indentured servitude is really contract slavery or contract enforced labor coming from Europe. So coming from Britain and coming from Ireland to a certain extent. So these indentured servants would sign a contract for 4 to 7 years. Their passage would be paid for to come to the New World. And they would work usually on a plantation for those 4 to 7 years, but they don't have freedom at that point. They would gain their freedom after those 4 to 7 years and be given a plot of land. Now that lasts for a while in some of the colonies, but really if you look at this this graph here, you're going to see a big change take place in the late 1600s, and it really corresponds with a couple of events. Within the colonies, there's a rebellion of former indentured servants called Bacon's Rebellion that takes place in 1676. And after that rebellion and corresponding events in Europe, where you have the growth of industrialization happening in Britain, which is providing jobs for people, and the quality of life is starting to improve in Britain, so less indentured servants want to come to the New World. What you're going to see develop here is a shift to African slavery within, like, specifically these southern colonies, like the Chesapeake Bay, and definitely in the Lower South, and an import of African slaves into the British colonies. Now, what I would note down is that slavery exists in all of the British colonies. So it's not just the Chesapeake Bay or the Lower South. It exists in all of them. It's just much more dominant in these Lower Southern and Chesapeake Bay regions. And it's less prevalent and less integral to the economy as the further you go north up into New England. Okay, so there's colonial slavery in both the North and the South. It's just that the Southern colonial slavery, it really is essential for their economy and kind of linked into their economy in a lot of different ways. Now, how does this compare to the Spanish and the French? The Spanish really in their North American and Central American and South American colonies are going to first start with trying to enslave natives, and then they shift to African slavery. So it's the encomienda system first, then they shift to slavery. The British really start with indentured servitude first, then they go to slavery. The French, in their North American colonies, they're not really plantation-based, so they're not emphasizing and bringing in large amounts of slaves into their North American colonies, but in their Caribbean colonies, they definitely import slaves as well in substantial numbers, like in Haiti, in some of their Caribbean colonies. Okay, the last big element you want to look at with the British colonies, which makes them pretty unique, the British have this philosophy, this idea of salutary neglect, which really allows the British colonies to develop self-government. And what that leads to is democratic ideas developing within the British colonies. So this is very unique. The British are very hands-off. They let their colonies develop on their own. The Spanish and the French are really not like that in their management of the colonies, and what it leads to is a lot of democratic ideas and republican ideas in the English colonies. All right, guys, we're going to